What's up, guys? So in today's video, I obviously want to talk about the new trailer for Spider-Man that just dropped. Now, right when you think Marvel might not be able to top what they did in Endgame, they drop a trailer like that, totally redeem themselves. This movie looks absolutely amazing, and I cannot wait to see it. So in this video, I want to talk about the comic story of how Doctor Strange cast a spell to make everyone forget who Spider-Man really was. And obviously, the reason why I want to talk about this is because this is what we see in the Spider-Man 3 trailer. That Peter comes to Doctor Strange, asking him for help to have the world forget that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. Now, this is an actual story that happened in the comics as well. So to give you some background, during the comic story of Civil War, Iron Man convinces Spider-Man to reveal his secret identity in hopes that this will get other heroes to join his side of the Civil War and sign up for the Superhero Registration Act, which is a light version of what happened with the Sokovia Accords in the MCU. So Peter reveals his secret identity, which is something that Spider-Man does not do. And that's because he's always worried about the health of MJ and Aunt May. So it really took a lot of convincing from Iron Man, a lot of guaranteed protections for his family, for him to do this. But as the Civil War story goes on, Spider-Man actually breaks away from Iron Man's side and joins Captain America's side. And after the Civil War story wraps up, Spider-Man no longer has the guarantees that were given to him by Iron Man. And what ends up happening is that Aunt May is shot and nearly killed. And then after that, the Kingpin puts a hit on MJ. And the Kingpin just wants everyone associated with Spider-Man to die. So after Mary Jane is nearly assassinated, Spider-Man goes to Doctor Strange and asks him if he can make the world forget that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. And the reason why he goes to Doctor Strange is because Doctor Strange was actually able to erase the memory of another superhero. This was, of course, the Sentry. But the reason he did that is because the Sentry has an evil side to him that's powerful enough to take over probably the entire universe. So it was kind of a must that he has the Sentry forget who he is, just so that his evil side doesn't get out. And when Peter first goes to Doctor Strange, he is very reluctant in doing this. See, the problem with the first time that Doctor Strange did it, nearly blew up in his face. The Sentry ended up remembering who he was, which at first made the Sentry believe that Doctor Strange and all the superheroes were actually bad guys that were actually against the Sentry, and that they were his enemy. But Spider-Man, continues to ask him, continues to beg for him to do this. And Doctor Strange seeing, Mary Jane nearly killed his Aunt May, shot in the hospital on the brink of death, he eventually tells Peter that, I'll think about it, and when I come back, I'll have an answer for you. And what Doctor Strange does here is he doesn't actually physically leave the room that Spider-Man's in. He just begins to meditate and he travels using the astral plane. And Peter doesn't know what he's doing. He just thinks he's kind of thinking about it over in his mind. He doesn't know that he's actually left to go talk to some other people. Who Doctor Strange actually goes to visit is Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four and Tony Stark. And it appears that Doctor Strange has pulled both Tony Stark's and Reed Richards' spirits to the astral plane with him. And when Doctor Strange goes to Reed Richards and Iron Man, he kind of makes his case of why they should do this. So Doctor Strange is already on board with doing this for Peter, and it's just convincing Iron Man and Reed Richards. And the case that he makes is that this is kind of our fault. We convinced Peter to reveal his identity during the Superhuman Registration Act. But both Reed and Tony say, do you know how dangerous this is? We've done this before. It didn't end that well. And it's important to note that when Doctor Strange made the world forget who the Sentry was, he did not ask Tony Stark to help him. He only asked Reed Richards. So he thinks that having Reed Richards and Iron Man is going to really help make the difference with making sure the spell works correctly. And that the spell that they actually did for the Sentry worked pretty well. It worked for a long time and it probably saved the whole world. And Reed kind of makes the argument that, what we did for the Sentry was for a reason. The Sentry is by far more powerful than Spider-Man will ever be. I mean, the Sentry is God level of strength. It can take out an entire world by himself. What you're asking us to do for Peter is just, we're doing it because Peter wants his privacy. There's no real reason to do this. And Doctor Strange again shoots back with, we should do this because, again, this is our fault that Peter is in this position to start with. Spider-Man, yes, he might not be as powerful as the Sentry. He might not be as smart as Reed Richards, but he's along the same lines as his morals as Steve Rogers. And he says, the boy is truly the best of us. And this is coming at a time that after Civil War, it was believed that Steve Rogers did die after the end of the Civil War, or was thought to be dead. Obviously, he comes back later because comics. And Iron Man shoots back with, yeah, he was like Steve Rogers, and now Steve Rogers is dead. And this is where an Iron Man really kind of shows his anger for what happened during the Civil War event. He basically says Peter did this to himself. He was an Avenger, and he turned his back on us. He's only in this problem because he joined Steve Rogers. And Doctor Strange, always trying to pull out their hearts, says, Tony, you really cared about Peter at one point. You believed in him. You're just upset because he stopped believing in you, and you feel betrayed. And you're hurting because during the Civil War, one of your best friends and fellow Avenger, Steve Rogers, died. And you can't get him back, but what you can do is save Peter. And this finally gets Iron Man on board. And Doctor Strange, pulling at Tony's guilt for essentially getting Steve Rogers killed, he agrees to help out Spider-Man. And one of the reasons why Tony agrees to do this is because if they're successful and they wipe everyone's mind of this, Tony will actually forget too that he had Peter give up his secret identity, almost got his aunt and Mary Jane nearly killed. And Reed Richards says that, we should still remember what happened. Because with the Sentry, the only person that allowed themselves to remember the Sentry is Doctor Strange. What would have happened if Doctor Strange died and no one else remembered who he was? We should all still remember Peter's identity. And Iron Man says, no, we've been playing Guardian for too long, and this has to end now. The only person who needs to remember is Peter. And the rest of us need to just get out of his life altogether and stop trying to fix his problems and just start trying to fix our own problems. And all three of them finally agree that they're going to go through with this and that nobody's going to remember what happened to Peter. And Iron Man finally asked the question, so how are we going to do this? And what Doctor Strange's plan is to use Tony, who has the Extremis virus inside of him. And the Extremis virus is essentially a super soldier serum. Iron Man 3 kind of had a version of it, but for some reason they were only like fire guys. Extremis in the comics is basically a virus that you inject yourself with. And it's essentially like a software virus that you inject into yourself. And it increases your strength, your healing, your ability to think faster. What really happens is that your body becomes, part machine. Tony's a little worried that even with Extremis, he might not be able to do what he's asking him to do. And what the whole plan is that Doctor Strange will be fusing magic kind of woven in with a virus that they're going to release on the whole world. It's going to give everyone basically amnesia of what happened with Spider-Man, and it's just going to pertain to this one memory that they have. The group's a little concerned that even with Tony with the Extremis, might not be able to control all that magic and such a large virus upon the entire world. But as typical Tony Stark, he's not going to back down from something, and he wants to go through with it. So with everyone on board, Doctor Strange leaves the astral plane and returns to Peter. And he asks Peter one more time, are you sure this is what you want to do? Peter answers, I'm certain this is what I want to do. And he tells Peter, pay close attention, because he's starting the spell immediately. And what we see is something that's kind of similar to what we saw in the trailer for the Spider-Man. It has a lot of these circles around kind of a center cell where Spider-Man's going to be standing. This kind of bubble that Spider-Man's in is just to keep him safe from the spell. So he'll be the only one that remembers what's happening. And he tells him, from this moment on, you will be the sole guardian of mistakes that never transpired. Remember and learn from them. And when this spell is cast, I'll be knocked out. And I want you to leave immediately, unless you want me to wonder why Spider-Man is here. So Spider-Man jumps into this bubble of safety, and he starts to spell. But as the spell begins to be cast, and again similar to what we see in the Spider-Man trailer, is that Spider-Man wants more people to remember who he is than just him. In the trailer we see that he wants his Aunt May to remember, he wants MJ to remember, he wants his friend Ned to remember. But in the story, he just wants Mary Jane to remember. So he jumps out of the bubble, grabs Mary Jane, and brings her into the bubble so that she will remember that he's Spider-Man still. And Doctor Strange even asks, he goes, Peter, what are you doing? Told you not to move. Peter tells him, I can't do this. I love her too much to keep a secret like this from her. But he continues the spell anyway, and when it's finished, Peter and Mary Jane there, and he says, let's go home. And when Peter takes Mary Jane back to her home, and everyone's forgotten who Spider-Man is, the spell went off perfectly. The only thing is that Mary Jane didn't want to remember. Because when she remembers all the pain that she's gone through as being Spider-Man's girlfriend. All the near-death experiences, all the times that Peter's almost died. And actually it leads into Mary Jane and Spider-Man breaking up. That's the story for another time, but on the good news, the spell worked great. No one remembers that Peter Parker's Spider-Man anymore. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the story. Hope you guys liked this video. If you did, make sure you slap that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.